Beneath the heat of one of the Earth's harshest deserts, Israel attempted something that should not have worked.
It's a real mission, valuable mission that you're doing for the people of Israel.
They cut a river through terrain long thought unbreakable, shifting billions of tons of sand to keep a nation alive.
Huge infrastructure, unprecedented infrastructure are being built now.
And in the salt-heavy waters of the Mediterranean, they found a way to create fresh water where nature offered none. What they built shouldn't exist, and yet it does. Here is how Israel reshaped its desert and stunned the world. When the desert became a death sentence, for years, the Negev desert crushed every attempt at survival, forcing families to abandon ancestral lands as their wells ran dry and entire villages became ghost towns where children once played. By the 1950s, southern Israel faced an agricultural collapse that threatened the young nation's existence. The Negev desert covered over 60% of Israel's land, but it was practically uninhabitable. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain fell for only a few weeks annually, and underground aquifers dropped steadily as each generation pumped them closer to extinction. Farmers watched their wells produce less water each year until they delivered nothing but warm, dusty trickles. Orchards that once fed entire regions shrank as trees died from dehydration. Irrigation ditches turned to dust. Without intervention, Israel risked losing one of its most critical food-producing regions. The contrast was stark. Northern Israel had abundant water from the Sea of Galilee and winter rains, while the south suffered chronic shortages. The solution seemed obvious: redistribute water from where it fell to where it was needed. But the obstacles were enormous. Moving water across hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain would require massive infrastructure, unprecedented engineering, and costs that could bankrupt a young nation still building its economy. The idea had been dismissed for years, but by the early 1950s, the calculation became simple: build this system or watch the desert win. Then came the decision that would change everything. In 1953, Israel approved construction of the National Water Carrier, one of the most ambitious engineering projects in modern history. The plan was audacious: transport water from the Sea of Galilee in the north, about 130 kilometers south, to the Negev desert, crossing mountains, valleys, and endless sand. It would take 11 years to complete and cost 420 million Israeli lira, but it was the only path forward. But before a single drop could flow, they had to solve a problem that had stopped engineers for centuries: forcing sand to become foundation. The Negev's dunes could bury months of construction work in a single night, and before engineers could build anything, they had to fight a landscape that refused to stay in one place. The challenge wasn't just moving water, it was building on ground that moved constantly. Dunes shifted with every strong wind, creating a surface so unstable that no canal or pipeline could survive without extensive preparation. Engineers deployed high-resolution satellites and ground-penetrating radar to map dune movement over months. They recorded thousands of wind measurements at different elevations to identify dangerous wind corridors where storms accelerated and stripped surfaces clean. Survey teams drilled boreholes over 100 feet deep to study the layers beneath, discovering that even apparently stable areas sat atop loose, wind-shaped sediment. Every route marker for the future canal had to be positioned with centimeter-level precision to avoid zones where sandstorms would erase progress overnight. A miscalculation of even a few feet could doom an entire section. Once the route was locked, hundreds of bulldozers moved in, flattening towering dunes and redistributing sand to create balanced surfaces. Crews worked around the clock because any delay allowed the wind to undo their progress. Construction teams had to move faster than the landscape itself. The breakthrough came when engineers realized that controlled moisture could stabilize loose sand. Water injected into dunes triggered a natural binding effect as grains adhered to one another. Networks of underground pipes delivered measured amounts of groundwater across key sections, with sprinkler arms spreading moisture that penetrated only a few inches deep. But that shallow layer changed everything. Heavy rollers followed immediately, pressing dampened sand until air pockets collapsed. Steel drums rumbled across miles of drifting ground, compressing it into surfaces strong enough to support cranes, trucks, and massive machinery. When the moisture dried under the desert sun, what had been a shifting landscape became a stable foundation. With stable ground finally beneath them, construction began on what would become the national water carrier, a system so precise that a single inch of error over 100 feet could render the entire project useless. Carving the lifeline. Construction crews removed 70,000 tons of sand and soil every single day, as over 1,200 workers endured 115-degree heat to carve a channel 130 kilometers long, with margins so tight that laser instruments had to check elevation every 160 feet. Construction officially began in 1953 with a clear mission: transport water from the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel to the arid Negev desert in the south. Before the carrier, northern regions had abundant water, while the south suffered chronic shortages. The carrier's purpose was simple: to redistribute the nation's water from where it fell to where it was needed most. The system combined open canals, underground pipelines, tunnels, and reservoirs across 130 kilometers of challenging terrain. The open canal sections averaged 150 feet wide and 23 feet deep, shaped in a wide U profile to allow gravity-driven water flow without constant pumping. The precision requirement was brutal. The canal slope had to stay within 1 inch per 100 feet. Even the smallest deviation could leave water stagnant or rushing too fast to control. Laser leveling instruments became essential. Every 160 feet, surveyors checked ground elevation, measured height, adjusted cuts, and moved forward. The desert offered no easy surface, but the margin for error was microscopic. Nothing went to waste. Excavated sand was reused to build embankments 10 to 16 feet high along both sides of the trench, creating walls that held back shifting dunes and gave the canal the stability it needed. Terrain varied dramatically. In the highlands, bulldozers carved through hard ground one layer at a time, slicing shelves into rock and compacted soil. In the lowlands, convoys of trucks hauled stabilized fill to raise sunken sections to correct elevations. Each mile demanded its own calculations and adjustments. Weak soil zones required special treatment. Engineers drilled 20 to 25-foot deep piles and filled them with compacted sand mixed with cement and clay, preventing the structure from slowly sinking over the years. The desert had to be given structural bones before it could support a water system. Temporary infrastructure sprouted along the route: concrete batching plants, mechanical workshops, fuel stations, and field engineer camps. Workers rotated through punishing shifts, battling heat, dust, and exhaustion. Trucks moved in endless convoys. Machinery groaned without pause. Every hour the system grew inch by inch, mile by mile. By 1964, the main construction was complete, but the channel still couldn't hold water. A carved trench is just an empty scar in the desert. The next phase would determine whether it could actually carry water or simply become the most expensive failure in Israel's history. Waterproofing against a thirsty desert. In the Negev, exposed water doesn't just evaporate. The sand actively swallows it within hours, and every inch of the canal had to be sealed with absolute precision, or billions of liters would vanish into the ground before reaching a single farm. This sealing phase became the most critical stage of the entire project. If waterproofing failed, the canal would become nothing more than a 130-kilometer ditch carved through sand at enormous expense. The process demanded surgical accuracy. Crews first spread a thin 2-inch layer of fine sand across the canal bed to prevent concrete from cracking under temperature shifts. Then came the real armor: massive concrete slabs 4 to 5 inches thick, each measuring 16 feet long and 10 feet wide. Every panel had to align perfectly with its neighbors while maintaining the canal floor's precise angle. Between slabs, teams inserted expansion joints. narrow gaps allowing concrete to expand and contract under brutal desert heat without shattering. Workers poured hot bitumen sealant into every joint, creating a flexible watertight shield that could move with the concrete while blocking even the smallest leak. In areas with unstable subsoil, engineers added a second waterproofing layer, a deep black HDPE geomembrane spread beneath the concrete like a giant protective sheet. Steel pins anchored it in place, and a sand cushion prevented equipment from tearing it during construction. This hidden layer would hold back millions of liters daily without ever being seen. The scale was staggering. Large sections of the canal system required this intensive waterproofing, forming one of the Middle East's most extensive sealed water channels. Along embankments, workers planted vetiver grass and desert acacia, using their roots to lock soil in place so storms wouldn't bury the sealed canal. But a sealed canal was still just expensive infrastructure. The canal needed a brain, a network of gates, pumps, and regulators working in perfect coordination, because a single failure could leave entire regions without water for weeks. Building the control network. The system required 9 massive steel gates at the Sapir pumping station to control water drawn from the Sea of Galilee, calibrated to millimeter tolerances because opening them too far could flood downstream farms, while closing them too much could trigger drought across hundreds of square kilometers. The national water carrier wasn't just a canal, it was a precision hydraulic system requiring constant regulation. At its head, the Sapir pumping station lifted water from the Sea of Galilee and directed it into the carrier through enormous steel gates. These gates metered exact volumes entering the system, serving as the first line of control for everything downstream. Beyond the pumping station, supporting infrastructure stretched across the country. Reinforced concrete bridges carried roads over the water corridor. Spillways allowed overflow to escape safely during rare storms. Siphons dipped beneath natural depressions, and long aqueducts lifted the canal across ravines and unstable terrain. Drainage culverts prevented floodwater from building pressure against embankments. Cross-drainage structures, massive conduits buried beneath the canal, allowed the Negev's seasonal waterways to continue their natural paths. Without them, flash floods could build pressure against canal walls and destroy the system in hours. These invisible safeguards were among the canal's most critical protections. The distribution infrastructure divided the main flow into secondary branches feeding farms, orchards, and reservoirs across the Negev. Automated valves and gates controlled water delivery based on regional demand, creating a branching network that could direct resources where needed most. Where the carrier crossed highways or rail lines, engineers built full-scale reinforced concrete bridges designed to withstand decades of desert heat and sand abrasion. The system is integrated with Israel's existing infrastructure, tying together roads, farms, industries, and towns. Everything depended on everything else. A jammed gate upstream could deprive entire districts of water. A blocked cross-drain could unleash floods that ripped open miles of embankment. The system only worked if every component performed flawlessly. After 11 years of construction, the national water carrier stood complete and ready for its ultimate test. The moment engineers had calculated, debated, and feared for over a decade had arrived. Would water actually flow when they opened the gates, or would the desert swallow everything they'd built? The water test. When engineers activated the pumps at the Sapir station for the first full test, they were betting 11 years of work and 420 million lira on a single question: would the desert let their river live? For over a decade, the national water carrier had existed only as engineering drawings and endless calculations. Every sealed panel, every compacted dune, every gate and embankment was theoretical until water touched it. Now, with the test beginning, the mood across the system shifted from confidence to barely concealed tension. If the canal leaked, buckled, or shifted even slightly, everything could fail in real time. The initial release was cautious. Engineers gradually increased flow rates while monitoring every section. Water crept into the head of the canal, advancing slowly as technical teams lined both sides with sensors, notebooks, and radios crackling with constant updates. At every checkpoint, crews measured wall pressure, checked expansion joints, read moisture levels beneath concrete, and scanned embankments for any sign of movement. 3 hours into the test, a monitoring station in the southern section reported unusual pressure readings. Engineers radioed the pumping station to reduce flow while teams rushed to investigate. For 20 minutes, the entire test hung in the balance. When they arrived, they discovered the sensors had been miscalibrated and the canal was performing perfectly. The relief was palpable, but the test continued. As the flow increased, the canal responded beautifully. Water swept across sun-baked concrete that had cracked from months of exposure, and steam rose in thin ribbons as cold water met surfaces hot enough to burn skin. When full operational capacity was reached, the transformation was complete. A powerful current surged forward, slapping against the sides and racing through the desert with confidence even the engineers hadn't fully expected. The first major pulse of water pushed southward, and everything changed. In the Negev, communities that had waited years gathered along embankments to witness something they'd been promised but never quite believed would happen. Children who had grown up seeing nothing but dust watched a river appear where land had always been dry. Farmers who had abandoned their fields during the worst drought years stood and watched as water flowed past. Technical teams marched beside the advancing water, measuring turbulence, monitoring slopes, examining seams, and radioing updates with urgent precision. But beneath the professional tension, something else emerged: relief. The national water carrier could transport up to 72,000 cubic meters of water per hour from the Sea of Galilee to the Negev, making it one of the world's most ambitious water transport systems. But there was a problem engineers had always known would come next. The water flowing through the canal was fresh from the Sea of Galilee, but it wasn't enough. As Israel's population grew and the Negev expanded, demand would eventually outstrip what the carrier could provide. The nation needed another source. The solution would require technology that didn't fully exist yet, a way to strip salt from seawater on an industrial scale that had never been attempted in the Middle East. When Israel learned to drink the sea. By the early 2000s, Israel faced a new crisis. The national water carrier couldn't meet growing demand, and the only unlimited water source was the Mediterranean Sea, filled with salt that could destroy crops and poison people faster than drought ever could. Israel's water challenge never truly ended with the national water carrier. Population growth, agricultural expansion, and climate change steadily increased demand while natural water sources remained fixed. By the 1990s, the Sea of Galilee was being overpumped, its levels dropping dangerously low. Underground aquifers showed signs of depletion and salt contamination. The nation needed a new source, and the only option was desalination. Desalination technology had existed for decades, but making it work at a national scale required massive investment and technical innovation. Israel began constructing industrial desalination plants along its Mediterranean coast, each one designed to process millions of cubic meters of seawater annually. With no major rivers, limited rainfall, and a growing population, desalination wasn't optional, it was survival. That desperation drove innovation. Israeli engineers pioneered cost-reduction techniques, energy-efficient membranes, and modular plant designs that made large-scale desalination economically viable for the first time. The largest facilities, Ashkelon, Hadera, and Sorek, became engineering feats in their own right. Together, they would eventually produce over 600 million cubic meters of fresh water yearly, covering nearly 80% of Israel's domestic water needs. The process starts with seawater intake, where water is drawn from the Mediterranean through underwater pipes. Pre-treatment removes large debris through mechanical filters, while settling tanks allow heavier particles to drop out. Oil separators clean surface contaminants, preparing water for the critical phase ahead. Fine filtration follows, using hollow fiber membranes to block algae, bacteria, and microscopic particles. These membranes act as ultra-thin barriers inside enormous filtration tanks, ensuring nothing compromises the next stage. Reverse osmosis is where transformation happens. High-pressure pumps force seawater through semi-permeable membranes with pores hundreds of times smaller than a human hair. Only pure H2O molecules pass through. Salts, heavy metals, and other contaminants stay behind. The pressure required is immense, tens of bars of compression maintained constantly to keep the flow steady. What emerges is almost too pure. The water lacks essential minerals, making it unsafe for drinking and agriculture. Dosing systems add back calcium and magnesium, rebalancing pH and restoring natural taste. Ultraviolet light and ozone eliminate any remaining microorganisms, while trace chlorine ensures safety during transport through pipelines. Every parameter is monitored digitally in real time. Salinity, pressure, flow rate, and purity are tracked 24 hours daily. Laboratory samples are analyzed constantly, and water is only released into distribution networks after meeting the strictest standards. From coastal storage tanks, desalinated water travels through underground pipelines to homes, hospitals, factories, and farms across Israel. The system connects seamlessly with the national water carrier, creating an integrated network where water from the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea work together to supply the entire nation. By 2025, desalination provided the majority of Israel's drinking water, and the technology Israel developed became a model studied worldwide. The combination was complete. The national water carrier transported fresh water from the north, while desalination plants provided unlimited water from the sea. Together, they eliminated the water scarcity that had defined Israel's existence for decades. But infrastructure alone wasn't enough. The real question was whether it would actually transform the desert. With unlimited water finally flowing to the Negev, the next few years would prove whether Israel's gamble would turn sand into gardens, or whether the desert would simply swallow everything they'd built. The desert that refused to stay dead. Within 5 years of the system reaching full capacity, satellite images captured something meteorologists said was impossible: a green ribbon stretching 130 kilometers across southern Israel, where climate models predicted nothing but sand for the next 1,000 years. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was undeniable. Land that had cracked under relentless sun returned to life. Farmers who had abandoned the Negev during decades of drought began returning, this time with confidence that water wouldn't disappear mid-season. They pitched tents, marked plots, and plowed fields their grandparents had given up as hopeless. Water reached farms through an innovation as important as the carrier itself: drip irrigation. Developed by Israeli engineer Simcha Blas in the 1960s, this technology delivered water directly to plant roots through networks of plastic tubes with tiny emitters. Instead of flooding entire fields and losing most water to evaporation, drip irrigation uses only what plants need, sometimes reducing water consumption by 70% while increasing yields. This efficiency turned the Negev from a liability into an asset. But the impact went far beyond agriculture. Villages were rebuilt, schools reopened, and modern farms equipped with advanced technology rose from the sand. Cities like Beersheba evolved from dusty outposts into thriving urban centers with populations exceeding 200,000. Parks, fountains, and tree-lined streets appeared in places that had known only dust and heat for centuries. The economic transformation was staggering. In 1948, the Negev's population was barely 50,000. By 2025, over 600,000 people lived in the southern desert, supported by technology companies, research centers, and solar installations. Agricultural output from the region increased 20-fold. The Negev shifted from economic burden to economic engine, contributing billions to Israel's GDP. Israel's achievement drew global attention. Countries facing water scarcity, from Jordan and Egypt to India, California, and Australia, sent delegations to study the model. Israeli companies exported desalination technology, drip irrigation systems, and water management expertise worldwide. What began as a national survival project became an international blueprint for water security. The environmental revival was unexpected but remarkable. Wildlife returned to the Negev as green corridors formed along the water system. Birds that had abandoned the region during drought years resumed migration patterns. Oases formed around reservoirs and irrigation ponds, creating ecosystems where none had existed for millennia. Cooperation replaced conflict in some cases. Israel began sharing water expertise with neighbors. Joint projects with Jordan developed water-sharing agreements along the Jordan River. Technical partnerships with Egypt focused on desalination and agricultural efficiency. Water, once a source of regional tension, became a bridge for collaboration. The question is no longer whether technology can transform a desert, But what lessons this transformation holds for the rest of the world? Israel didn't defeat the Negev desert through force. It succeeded by refusing to accept that water scarcity was permanent. The national water carrier, built across 11 years at enormous cost, proved that determined engineering could move resources across hostile terrain. Desalination plants demonstrated that the ocean itself could become drinkable. Drip irrigation showed that efficiency could matter more than abundance. Israel made a desert bloom with 1950s technology and sheer determination. So how impressive do you think Israel's engineering achievements really are? Drop your answer in the comments section below, and if you want to see more stories about impossible engineering projects that changed the world, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.